Greetings, Gilliam the Rogue here once again with an Elder Scrolls Online Let's Talk segment. This time we'll be delving deeply into the bow's weapon skill line for the Elder Scrolls Online and all of its glory for PvP and PvE application in terms of meta performance. Let's start today right off with our active abilities, and our first ability is called Snipe, the main spammable of the weapon skill line. Snipe operates via a 1.1 second cast time, can be cast up to a whopping 35 meters range, and scales with the basic things such as max stamina, weapon damage, armor penetration, and weapon critical, as well as using mighty, piercing, and precise strikes in the champion point system. Note that there is a cast time, however, it only deals a singular hit of damage, therefore it is not considered a damage over time effect. Remember, cast times only are considered dots if there are multiple damage increments within them. If they deal a singular damage application, they will not use thaumaturge, or if they do, it is considered a bug. As we see here by the tooltip, despite my no CP spent and very little passives, the damage of Snipe is quite hefty, and on top of this it will scale even further thanks to a few passives of ours, allowing for the high cast time to be kind of negated in terms of sustained DPS. The biggest issue with Snipe in its base form is that cast times operate extremely difficultly with weaving in terms of meta performance for many players. They're not necessarily difficult to weave, but they're hard to perfectly weave, so you're constantly having to time things perfectly every single time. So missing a single one is extremely detrimental to your DPS because you have all of your damage spread out by these long 1.1 to 1.5 second cast times based on human error. So if you aren't spamming left click or you aren't very familiar with the animation, it's going to be very easy to miss. However, once you get the hang of things, it's very, very easy to upkeep, and the only time it becomes an issue is when you're in high combat load situations where you're reacting to mechanics. Now, it should be noticed that when you're casting it, you do not move at full speed, so this does make it kind of a risk-reward application in terms of PvE performance, where there are a lot of mechanics going on, while in PvP, the large range kind of negates this issue and allows you to sit back from afar and be more defensive in those terms. Gives you some breathing room in terms of reaction. It's a very safe playstyle. Now we'll look at our morphs. Our first morph is called Lethal Arrow, and instead of dealing physical damage, it will now deal poison damage. On top of this, whenever it is casted between 5 meters and 35 meters, it will apply the poison status effect, which is a secondary effect. All the poison status effect does is deals damage over a 9-second interval within 1.5 second damage increments. It deals decent damage, and it will be considered a damage over time effect, thus using thaumaturge on top of the basic damage scaling coefficients in the champion point system. The poison status effect does roughly 1k DPS in terms of meta performance with buffs up and amplifications, and this can be increased with other sets such as Morag Tong. That's the really nice thing about Lethal Arrow and a few of our other bow skills is that they're going to synergize extremely well with some of the item sets that we have access to in the game. So that is definitely something to look out for, especially paired with Morag Tong, where poison attacks deal 10% more damage. That's 10% more damage on your Lethal Arrow, the main dot, as well as the AoE and even one of our ultimate choices. So that set is extremely powerful if you like going the full bow route. Now, on top of all of the good stuff of dealing poison damage, scaling with some sets, and applying the poison status effect, it also inflicts the enemy with Major Defile, meaning that they take 30% less healing for 10 whole seconds. That's really, really handy, especially since it means that you're not forced into recasting over and over again, because usually Major Defile is a very short window of time, like 5 seconds or 6 seconds. So almost double the duration allows you to commit some other actions in between as well. So that's very, very handy for both PvE and in PvP, because Major Defile is going to help take care of those pesky healers who are just spamming breath, etc. And then the long range and bonus damage is going to be very helpful as well. On top of this, if you're fighting a werewolf, they're going to be taking crazy high damage. Remember, werewolves take 25% more poison damage, so very, very strong in those regards. The next morph is called Focused Aim, and Focused Aim retains its physical damage form, and then this morph makes it so anytime you hit a target with Focused Aim, that target can be hit by bow attacks from you and allies by another 5 meters. So instead of Focused Aim having a 35 meters range, it'll have a 40 meters range. Your light attacks are normally a 28 meters range, they'll be 33, etc. Everything gets added on for 5 meters except volley, because volley is casted at an area. So since this applies a debuff on the target requires it to be casted onto them. So casting a free-floating ability will not increase the range. On top of this, the enemy will also be inflicted with Minor Fracture, one of very few ways to apply this debuff in the game, which reduces their physical resistance by 1320. In terms of PvP, this is a 2% damage increased against a target, as if you just take player resistance, which is 660 for each 1%, so 1320 divided by 660 is a 2% damage mitigation increase. And then for PvE mobs, it is divided by 500 because mobs are technically coded as level 50 entities rather than C160 entities. So that 500 makes it slightly more efficient, which gives a 2.64% damage increase average. Now, this can fluctuate depending on how much damage you're doing. It's very easy to explain if you use different damage sources. So you're going to see some gains with certain abilities, and then others are going to be less. So it doesn't have a total DPS value, but the average is just given by the division of whatever target you're hitting. So 660 against a player, and then 500 against an NPC. So very helpful, especially since Minor Fracture is very rare to come by debuff. The only other sources in the game currently are Power of the Light from the Stamina Templar, as well as Poisons, which have a 10-second cooldown and aren't really able to be kept up 100%. And since Focused Aim lasts 10 seconds and Power of the Light lasts 6, it's much easier to keep this debuff up via Focused Aim than it is from Power of the Light. So kind of helpful in that regard. If you're going for more solo play and you are the only stamina build in group, then you're probably going to be better off with Lethal Arrow. But if you're playing with a lot of stamina builds or you're in PvP, you might want to take Focused Aim because the extra range gives you more survivability in terms of extra reaction time, a longer distance the enemy has to close. It's safer, and then Minor Fracture is going to be really, really helpful there too. Or if you're in with multiple PvE players that are also stamina, that Minor Fracture is going to benefit everyone in the group. So you have two fantastic morph options here. Very hard to choose from. It depends on what you're going for. Our next ability is called Volley, and it is the ground AoE damage over time function of this skill line. Now, in and of itself, Volley is an extremely potent skill, so it can be casted up to 25 meters away from you. Its base radius is a 5 meters radius, which is not too big, but it's not too small either. And then it lasts 8 seconds. Now, the really nice thing about this ability is that it hits every half second. So that means you get 16 ticks of damage out of one cast per target. So that really allows to ramp up in damage when enemies are sitting still. So in PvE, Volley is going to be a fantastic skill in terms of utilization for DPS, while in PvP, it's not going to be that great unless you're fighting in choke points or you're playing with a Dragonite who's very good at using talons and keeping enemies in place. Because in PvP, you can simply walk out of ground AoEs. So it's going to be way less efficient versus in PvE, where a tank has a taunt and then just keeps a boss or a group of enemies sitting still. So Volley, very, very, very good for PvE performance. and situationally decent for PvP. On top of this, this will be able to be used in tandem with a Maelstrom bow, increasing the damage of the volley tick even further and stacking upon itself, allowing for some extreme extra damage from this skill. Because it operates every 0.5 seconds, this tooltip is multiplied by 16 and it adds on top of each other each time. So very, very strong meta for every PvE stamina build at the moment, just because it offers so much free damage. But even in and of itself, volley is a very potent skill. Since it deals damage in increments over time, that will mean that it uses thaumaturge in the champion point system as well. So keep that in mind, that it's going to be very, very potent, especially as we move forward into the champion point system and are allowed to cap things like thaumaturge and mighty. So very, very strong. But now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Endless Hail, and all it does is it reduces the cost of the skill roughly by about 400, so not entirely noticeable, but still kind of nice. And then it increases the duration from 8 seconds to 10 seconds. So remember that it hits in 0.5 second intervals. That means you get a whole 4 additional damage sources out of it, and you get an additional 4 increases of damage from the Maelstrom bow, allowing it to do insane damage when enemies are sitting inside of it. Now, the only disadvantage of this is that, remember that the 5 meters is, it's not small, but it's not large either. So this is the base morph, the 5 meters. So it's pretty easy to hit most targets in here, but on trash and stuff or boss fights where there's a lot going on and the battlefield is spread out through a large area, this isn't going to be possible to hit everything with. So just because it scales better with Maelstrom bow doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be more DPS when we compare it to our other morph. And our other morph is called Arrow Barrage, and it retains all of the same stuff, where it's an 8-second duration, but instead of having a 25 meters range, it can be casted 30 meters away, and instead of having a 5 meters radius, it has a 7 meters radius, so an additional 2 meters, allowing it to hit way, way, way more targets. And we're going to take this morph, so it hits way more targets, really enabling much higher DPS in terms of realistic performance. Like if you notice the size increase of this, it's extremely noticeable, and it's very handy on trash fights and in stuff like in Maelstrom Arena, where not all of the adds will cooperate because some of them are ranged, or when the battlefield of the boss is really spread out. So like AA with the mage. So sometimes Atronox, or the mini mages as we call them, will spawn spread out from the mage, the main boss, making it hard to hit all in one little area. So Arrow Barrage really gives us some breathing room, allowing us to hit more targets. Same with hard mode Rakat, where we're going to be having assassins and stuff that we don't necessarily want to stack directly on top of the boss. So covering more area means more targets hit, which means more overall damage. So in terms of which morph you want to take, if you prefer the single target mode or you have some God mode tanks, then you're going to want to take Endless Hail, because those extra 4 damage ticks not only are going to mean that it's easier to manage the dot, but it's also going to be much stronger with the Maelstrom bow. But if you're fighting more realistic encounters, or you want to be more versatile in terms of holistic DPS throughout an entire dungeon rather than just min-maxing a parse for a single fight, like a single target one, then Arrow Barrage is going to be better suited for you. And this is the morph that I personally take, because I think it's just much more versatile. You do more DPS in terms of the entire dungeon, so trash and bosses, not just bosses. And then it's just a really fantastic skill, even in single target. So very, very strong ability. Definitely deserves a bar space in PvE no matter what. And then in PvP, you can still make use of it if you're fighting in choke areas, like in towers, or if you have like a Dragon Knight who's just chaining and talonsing and just keeping everyone locked in place. But now we will go on to our next ability, and that is Scattershot. All Scattershot does is you deal damage with a quote-unquote explosive arrow. It just deals physical damage, the same as normal physical attacks, and then you knock that enemy back 6 meters and you disorient them for 5 seconds. Now, it should be noted that Scattershot has a 10 meters range, so this is kind of like when enemies get in your face or are starting to close the gap and you want them to back off. Scattershot is meant for that, so this isn't meant as a spammable. Remember, Snipe has a 35 meters range and Scatter's only going to have a 10, so this is like a last resort of like, get away from me, or trying to retreat, something of the sort, or you see a healer casting spells and you want to like knock them down on their butt for a bit. Scattershot's going to help in that regard, but it's not meant to be used from a very far range. This is also going to limit its scaling in terms of damage with one of our passives, and that's also going to mean that you can't really utilize it as a spammable in terms of damage. However, one of our morphs is going to do a little bit more than that, so it's not meant as a DPS spammable, but you can spam it and still gain effectiveness out of it. So the stamina cost is rather low when we look at some of our other skills, so that's kind of helpful. And then it's an instant cast, requires a target obviously, and then it's going to scale with all the good stuff, same as normal. But we'll look at our morphs, and our first one is called Magnum Shot, and it increases the damage, not too much, by about 500 or so noticeable, increases the scaling mechanism. And then it also knocks you back 6 meters away from the target. So it still knocks them back 6 meters, and then it knocks you back. So that's a 12 meters distance you've created rather than a 6 meter. And now in PvE, it's not really going to be justified as a bar slot just because it's like not a gap closer, but a gap creator, and you don't necessarily need that because you can kind of just sit in the back and snipe, and you have very long ranged ability, so you don't really have to worry about this stuff unless maybe you're doing solo play or you're just dinking around. But in terms of meta performance, Scattershot is in PvE. We're not going to have much use for it. So yeah, Magnum Shot's going to be really strong for PvP in terms of the defensive route, where you want to create distance, get away from your enemy, and then just maintain one of our passives that deals the increased damage based on how far we are. So that'll help in that regard. But yeah, remember, in PvE, not so hot, doesn't really fit in well, even with the increased damage. And then our other morph is called Draining Shot, and all Draining Shot does is after the disorient ends on an enemy, you're going to be healed by it. So it should be noted that with the Draining Shot morph, there's going to be some issues with it in terms of how we're going to get this heal. So disorienting an enemy for 5 seconds is going to be almost identical to Luminous Shards or Agony or something. So if you remember with Disorients, if you hit an enemy with them, since they operate as a soft CC, then they're going to break, and they're not going to actually stun them for the whole listed duration unless they don't take any damage. So this is kind of the issue with the Disorient effect, is we're not going to be able to make good use of it in PvE because we're going to be dealing constant damage. While in PvP, it's going to be a little bit different because it's going to be 5 seconds to get resources back, to create some distance, to get our bearings back, or to line up some burst, which is really, really helpful in PvP, but not so much in PvE. And on top of this, the heal only activates after the Disorient ends, and recasting the skill will technically end the Disorient, but will also grant the enemy CC immunity, meaning they cannot be disoriented again. So you can't spam cast this and get health back like infinitely and stuff. It can't be used as a damaging heal ability like Funnel Health or something of the sort. It can only be activated once every 5 or 7 seconds because CC immunity next patch will go up to 7 seconds instead of 5. So the heal in terms of like HPS or healing per second efficiency is going to be very, very weak. Now, the still nice thing about this is that the heal will further scale with our stamina, weapon damage, all that good stuff. The heal can crit, so it's still going to be a nice way to get some health back in terms of PvP. So we have two morphs, one that creates more distance, which enables us to escape or to ramp up one of our passives, or we have one that allows us to get a heal. And honestly, it depends on your playstyle. So if you're running a two-hander, and vigor, you're probably not going to need much healing. But if you're running dual wield in bow in PvP or bow in PvP, then draining shot's going to offer some more versatility, and you don't have to run that two-hander with rally, or you don't have to run healing potions, because you're going to have another heal in your kit that's allowed to be used in terms of like an oh shit moment where you need that small amount of healing just to survive a little bit longer, to dodge roll once more, or to get to safety, or to burst the enemy back down. So honestly, the morph choice is up to you. I like Magnum for more offensive routes, and then Draining for defensive. Still very solid ability in PvP, but rather useless in PvE at the moment. Now we'll look at our next ability, which is the AoE ability of this weapon line, and that's called Aerospray. So Aerospray operates by a conal, so it's going to be similar to Cleave, except it's going to be way stronger than Cleave. It goes out to 20 meters, so that's very, very helpful, and then it's going to grow in size the farther it travels. So notice how far out it travels at the final hit. So if we cast this from here, it's still going to hit him. So very, very helpful, and it's going to easily hit all 4 of these enemies when we use it. So in terms of an expansive area, it's very strong, and it allows you to have some freedom of movement, because I can easily just walk around this group of enemies, repositioning myself and dealing damage. But in terms of radial AoE, like if this stuff was spread out all around me, it'd be very hard to hit. So it's still not going to hit as many targets as, say, Steel Tornado or Power Extraction or something of the sort, but it's still going to offer some great damage. It's going to scale further based on how far away we are, although it will not be able to benefit from the full efficiency of the passive that I'm referring to, which I'll explain later, because its maximum range is right outside of the maximum scaling efficiency out of that passive. But the other nice thing about Aerospray is it's also going to snare an enemy by 40% for 5 seconds after they take damage. So in PvE, this kind of helps keep enemies in place and allows you to kite if you're in solo, or to just control them on the battlefield for so when they're all nice and clumped up and they're trying to disperse, you can kind of lock them in place and give your tank more time to react, to chain them back or talons them or something of the sort. And then in PvE, it's just going to be another snare. So very helpful in those regards. Very strong AoE ability. But now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Bombard. And all it's going to do is whenever you deal damage with this skill, you're also going to immobilize the enemy for 2 seconds. And an immobilized is like a root where you can't move, but it's not a hard CC. So you can dodge roll to break it, or you can just wait, but you can still perform actions while rooted. You just can't move around freely. So you're going to have to use Shuffle or Forward Momentum, Berserker's Rage, which is the two-handed ultimate that gives us CC immunity, or to dodge roll. And those will all remove immobilizations. Otherwise, we're just going to wait the 2 seconds, and then after the immobilization ends, then they're going to be they're hit by the snare. Now, the really nice change about this ability was before you could just infinitely spam this and lock people in place with nothing they could do. And it was a very, very toxic skill in Cyrodiil, and even some PvE application, because you could literally just keep hitting enemies over and over again and they would just not be able to move. So what they did was they made it so while they're snared, they cannot be immobilized. So if an enemy has a snare on them, they can't be immobilized. Now, this is a blessing and a curse, because it helped tune down the toxicity of this ability, but it also made it really redundant in terms of group performance, because snares are so easily accessible in this game and applicable. Like Templars apply them in a massive 12 meters radius just by having Purifying Light down, or Caltrops, which is an even bigger radius, also going to snare. So anytime an enemy is snared, when you use Bombard, they can't be immobilized. So that's really going to lessen the efficiency. So Bombard is meant as an opener, but not as like a spammable to keep them in place. And then on top of that, if you're constantly spamming it over and over, you're reapplying that snare, so you're not going to be able to make use of that immobilization. So I would kind of like to see something else be done with the immobilization. I think the immob should just go away. It doesn't really fit anymore, especially since it can't reapply if an enemy is snared, and you're just infinitely reapplying snares when you're casting it. I think adding some damage, like maybe a bleed or something, or increasing the range or something, they could do something cool with the skill to make it more fit in with the name of Bombard, rather than just this useless morph at the moment, because it's not going to operate, because it's counterintuitive. Because if you're constantly snaring an enemy, but the immobilization only works against non-snared enemies, you can't make use of it. So I'd like to see something else happen. But our other morph is the really nice one, and that's called Acid Spray. So just like Lethal Arrow did, Acid Spray is going to rework the damage from physical into poison. Now, it'll still use armor penetration. It'll still use all the same stuff in CP, nothing to worry about there. But remember, it's going to enable for that set synergy like Morag Tong or other abilities like Swamp Raider and stuff. So going to up the efficiency if we're using it with sets like that. Very helpful in that regard. And then Poisoned has the chance to proc the Poisoned status effect, as well as dealing bonus damage to poison vulnerable enemies, such as ogres or harpies. Now, it also means that when we're dealing damage to poison-resistant enemies, that it's going to deal a little bit less damage. They're going to have slightly more resistance, about 400 more. Most enemies in PvE in terms of trials have about 18,200 resistance. But if they're resistant to an element, they're going to have 18,600. So an extra 400 armor or resistance, which isn't even 1% damage. So it's really, really negligible. But still, something to keep in mind. But if they're vulnerable to it, then they have 0 resistance. And then armor penetration or spell penetration becomes useless because they're taking true damage from the skill. So very, very helpful in those regards. And then the ability on top of this, when you hit an enemy with their weakness, so like ice elementals that are weak to fire or ogres that are weak to poison, you're going to have the chance to proc not a secondary effect, but a tertiary effect, which means it's 3. But so fire procs explosion, disease procs pestilence, and then poison procs venom. And all venom does is it does a big burst of damage to that enemy who's weak. And on top of this, it's going to scale not only with weapon damage, armor penetration, all that good stuff, but it's also going to scale based on how hard the poison hit. So with Acid Spray and Lethal Arrow, since those are kind of hard-hitting abilities, when Venom procs, it's going to be all the bigger. So very, very helpful when fighting those enemies. However, in terms of application to like PvE, there are very few ogres or harpies in the game. Most of them are, the only time you'll see this in trials is in Mauve Lorcage on Trash when you're fighting ogres. So not really applicable to raid DPS, but still very handy, very helpful. And then dealing with werewolves in PvP is also going to deal some additional damage to them. So other than reworking from physical into poison damage, on top of the snare and all that good stuff, is it's also going to inflict an additional damage over time effect, which will scale with Thaumaturge. So that's very handy. And the other nice thing about this is that unlike Cleave, we're not going to have to wait for the tick. So if I demonstrate here, you're going to see 2 damage ticks immediately, and that's because Acid Spray's dot ticks immediately. So even if I'm spam casting this, I'm still getting the effect out of the Acid Spray dot. So we're going to get a lot of damage from that, especially in AoE, ultimately allowing it to be much stronger than anticipated. Like with Cleave, the issue was like, okay, we get a nice dot out of it, but the dot is useless if we're spam casting it. And an Acid Spray isn't going to suffer that as much. Now, if you still like spam cast it, it's not going to get the full damage out of it because it has to tick over 5 seconds instead of the instant. So if you're recasting it, it will refresh. And I would really like to just see all dots in the game that apply with skills, so like cleave, twin slashes, acid spray, axes bleed. I would like to see them stack in terms of like if they apply to an enemy, instead of refreshing and negating damage, it adds additional damage or duration, or maybe even both. So I really think that would help a lot of these meh skills be much stronger, as well as adding some stack-based gameplay, which I think this game sorely needs, because it'd be really interesting, and you could add a lot of dynamic passives and item sets that dealt with managing debuffs that stacked rather than just keeping them up one at a time. But still, Acid Spray, usually the morph that I go to, just because Bombard is in kind of a mess spot right now, but Acid Spray is super fantastic, going to hit a lot of enemies, going to synergize well with sets. The dot is rather efficient because it's still going to be able to be used even if we're spam casting, and then just getting all those juicy extra effects like proccing Venomous, proccing the Poison Sadist effect, doing bonus damage, and then it's going to keep all the good stuff of the snare and whatnot. So very, very strong ability. Now the last ability in the bow skill line is the damage over time skill of the tree, and that is Poison Arrow. And Poison Arrow is a very, very strong skill. If we look at it, all it does is it hits the enemy with initial damage, and then it applies a damage over time effect which ticks over 10 seconds. So just like any other dot, if you spam cast this, the dot is not going to apply immediately. But the other nice thing is that it does decent upfront damage. So it's not going to be completely awful if we spam cast this, but it's definitely not going to be advisable compared to something like Snipe or something. But if we're moving around and we're just waiting to like reposition ourselves like on a boss, it's not the end of the world if you have to recast this a few times just to keep up some damage or pressure on an enemy in PvE or in PvP. So kind of nice. It doesn't cost much, can be cast from pretty far away. And then on top of that, remember, since it has an initial and a damage over time effect, the initial will not use Thaumaturge, but the damage over time effect will. And then when you're trying to discern, okay, what's the best CP allocation for myself, you have to remember to break up Poison Arrow into two different sources, because one is only going to scale with Mighty, and then the other is going to scale with Mighty and Thaumaturge. So in terms of like CP allocation, if you clump it up all as a dot, then it's going to make Thaumaturge look way more efficient to put points into, but in reality, it's not going to be as efficient because it's split into initial and damage over time. So you have to keep that in mind when you're theory crafting and gathering numbers and stuff like that. But now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Venom Arrow. And Venom Arrow operates as an interrupt. It changes the flavor text. Instead of Bandari Poison, we use Shadow Scale, so it's going to be Argonian stuff, if you're into that. But in terms of like what it does in combat is whenever you hit an enemy that is casting an ability, so channeling or casting, and the cast isn't a stamina ability, so if you hit this on someone using Wrecking Blow or Snipe, it won't do anything. But if they're casting an ability, they're interrupted, so the cast will be stopped, they will be set off balance, and then they'll be stunned for 3 seconds. And remember that off balance is going to proc the ritual thing, or the ritual's passive, the Exploiter. So we're going to do 10% more damage to them when this activates, and then they're also going to be stunned for 3 seconds. So that's 3 seconds of Exploiter passive uptime. So on top of this is in PvE, when you set a mob off balance, it enables them to be exploited. And no, I don't mean cheating, but if you've ever noticed when you're playing, it says hold left click or whatever your heavy attack button is to exploit. That means you're targeting an enemy that's off balance. If you heavy attack them, which doesn't necessarily have to be fully charged, you could literally hold it down for a millisecond. Just dealing damage with a heavy attack will knock them on their butt. So it's going to add duration to that stun timer, which is going to make them take more damage. They're going to be on the ground, less counterplay. But in PvP, when you set an enemy off balance, that heavy attack dynamic does not work. So if an enemy in PvP is off balance, you can't heavy attack them to knock them over. Now, I really don't know why this is. I think it really lowers the value of off balance, and it kind of makes it redundant in PvP. I would really like to see something interesting. Otherwise, just bring in the ability to heavy attack. I mean, ZeniMax loves heavy attacking in this game, probably a little more than they should in terms of enforcing gameplay, but it makes heavy attacks viable in more than just returning resources. And since they're like such this big windup of 2 whole seconds to like ready up your attack, you're gifted with a reward. So it's kind of like this risk reward in the sense of like, all right, I'm risking damage because I'm delaying my attack for 2 seconds, but if you use it properly, you're gifted with extra damage, like hitting an enemy off balance, going to do more damage, going to knock them on their butt, so they're going to be, so Exploiter passive is going to proc. So very, very helpful in that regard. But in PvE, the amount of times we can get this interrupt is going to be really, really negligible because it's not going to be wholly applicable to combat. So not a very good PvE morph, but in PvP, the really nice thing about this is going to help take care of beam spammers or crystal frag casters or anyone using cast times in PvP like Dark Flare. So when they're trying to sit in the back being safe, you can just use Venom Arrow on them, which sets them off balance, interrupts them, stuns them, and all that good stuff. So very, very helpful in PvP. Now, Poison Injection is our other morph, and this is the one that I prefer for both PvE and in PvP, because Venom Arrow is going to have, like, its strength is dependent on the enemy you're fighting and if they're using cast times and stuff like that, and not everyone does. So if they're not, Venom Arrow is going to be really inefficient, but Poison Injection is going to be always efficient no matter what. And all it does is it increases the damage of this skill from the damage over time of component by 200% more based on how much missing health they have. So it only gets to 200% at 0.1% HP, but it starts scaling and gets its first 1% amp at 50% health. So it starts scaling really, really quickly. Very, very helpful. And in PvE, this thing is going to do monster DPS, especially if you pair it with a Maelstrom Dagger. So if you use Flurry with Maelstrom Daggers and then bow swap or bar swap to your bow and use Poison Injection, this will consume Cruel Flurry and just do tremendous damage, especially at low health when that execute is ramping up, just because it's going to get so much extra weapon damage and scale really, really well. So a very, very strong ability, and even without Maelstrom Daggers, this dot is going to do a hell of a lot of damage. So very, very important to keep up even before 50% health, because it does nice initial damage, it lasts a decent amount of time, and it's going to do still nice damage over time, even though my tooltip doesn't really reflect that. But remember, I'm not wearing like gold gear, it's not BIS, I don't have any champion points spent, I don't have passives and stuff, so this thing can tick for up to 30k in PvE with like Warhorns up and Trap Beast, Maelstrom Daggers and all that stuff. And like even without Maelstrom Daggers, it can tick for like 20k in a single hit, which is from the damage over time function. So very, very good in both PvE and in PvP. And the other nice thing about Poison Injection is that if you prefer the bow route and you like playing more bow instead of bow dual wield, you can use the master bow, which is going to amplify your poison arrow. So whenever an enemy is inflicted with poison arrow, you're going to gain an additional 301 weapon damage. Now this doesn't stack, so you can't just apply Poison Injection on 5 guys and get 1500 weapon damage. But it's still going to give a little burst of weapon damage, and it's going to be really nice in PvP too, because you can just charge up a heavy attack, release with a Poison Injection, and crit rush in with your two-hander or something, and just do super high burst damage, and then have that extra weapon damage to just annihilate people in terms of like singular applications. So it synergizes extremely well with gear, and since it deals poison damage still, it's going to have the ability to use Morag Tongs, use Swamp Raider, use some of these sets in the game, so it's going to allow for some even higher scaling. So very, very fantastic ability. Now we will go on to our ultimate, and that is Rapid Fire. So how Rapid Fire works is a channel time, since I'm not sure if it can be interrupted. I've never seen it happen. I want to say it can't, but at the same time, I'm not 100% sure. The only difference with this channel time versus others is you can move at full speed while you're channeling it. So that's kind of helpful. The cast time is a 4.1 second. Can be casted at the 28 range, basic max range of ranged attacks, and then it lasts 3.3 seconds. So you channel over 4.1, but it only deals damage over 3.3. So there's a little bit of wind up before you can deal damage with it. And then it costs 175 ultimate, which is kind of expensive. Now, since it deals with a channel time and it deals multiple damage hits over that set period of time, it's also going to be considered a dot, meaning additional scaling from thaumaturge. So the tooltip can be ramped up quite high. It should be noticed that even though it is a single target damage over time, it cannot be amplified by Maelstrom daggers. So you cannot use Flurry and then swap and use Rapid Fire. I mean, I can even demonstrate here. So if we look here, our Rapid Fire tooltip is 31220. If I cast Flurry and quickly open, it's still going to be the exact same. Versus if we look at Poison Injection or Poison Arrow, it's going to be 5200. But if I cast Cruel Flurry, that's going to go up to 7640 because it's reflecting that it can scale with that. So Rapid Fire cannot use Cruel Flurry. So that kind of hurts it, because if it could, that'd be really, really awesome, and it would help the bow out in terms of a viable ultimate for single target. But it can at the moment, so really unfortunate. But still, all around a decent ultimate, gives the bow some option because they really, really needed one, because there are no other stamina based ultimates in the game that can be casted from a range, because Meteor is the one ranged option that we have, and then Soul Strike is the other one. And the issues with these are they deal magic and flame damage, so they're not going to scale properly with us. They're going to use magic or spell penetration. They're going to use Elemental Expert instead of Mighty, so they're just not going to do enough damage for us. So the Bow Ultimate helps kind of bridge that gap in terms of scaling. But in terms of meta performance, Rapid Fire is kind of not that good, just because the full bow at the moment is not performing to the same letter that Dual Wield is. So unfortunate in that regard, but it adds options for you if you like the bow route. But now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Toxic Barrage. And similarly to Acid Spray or Lethal Arrow, it's going to convert that physical damage into poison damage, enabling all of those juicy things like doing true damage against weak enemies, having the chance to proc poisoned, having the chance to proc venom, scaling with good sets, etc., etc. So on top of dealing poison damage now, after the 4.1 seconds of channel time, it's also going to apply a secondary dot that lasts over 8 seconds. And it's going to do roughly half, a little bit over, what the initial cast time did. So very, very strong in that regard. You can still move at the full speed. And it should be noted that the secondary effect of Toxic Barrage can be empowered with Cruel Flurry. However, in its current state, it is literally impossible to do so, because Cruel Flurry lasts 4 seconds and Rapid Fire is a 4.1 second cast time, meaning we're not going to be able to get that secondary poison effect applied with Cruel Flurry. So if Toxic Barrage or Rapid Fire's channel time went down to 3.3 seconds instead of 4.1, then if you're really, really fast, you could bar swap and then instantly do this, and you could be okay. But unfortunately, you can't. So I would like to see that happen. That'd be kind of cool. I would like to see an emphasis of risk reward for the bow to allow them to like get into melee range, deal some high damage, and then hightail out of there before they start taking damage. So I think that'd be really cool. Add some risk reward to the bow playstyle, because right now it's just very, very safe. So a lot of newer players are going to like bow, but in terms of damage performance for the meta, it's going to cap out really quickly. And I think if they kind of emphasized balancing staying at max range and then getting in close and then going back out, that would be really, really cool and allow for some extra damage while also making them more susceptible to punishment. So I think that'd be really cool. But still, Toxic Barrage, really nice ultimate if you like staying from a range, if you like using Morag Tong, Swamp Raiders, those kind of sets that amplify your poison damage, you like that playstyle, then Toxic Barrage is going to be really, really kick-ass. But now we'll look at our other morph, and that is Ballista. And instead of you casting this skill and channeling it, you place it down and it operates similarly to a pet. However, this one doesn't suck, surprisingly. So Ballista is really, really strong in a few applications. Now, in terms of like holistic DPS and PvE, like trials and dungeons, it's not going to be that good because it only hits one target. And the same can be said about Toxic Barrage. But in terms of damage against like a singular enemy, like a boss or an elite, or like in Maelstrom Arena, where burst damage, you want to do as much damage in as short amount of time as possible, then Ballista is going to be fantastic because it's going to do some monster DPS in terms of look at how high that tooltip is with no buffs, with no CP, with no passives, nothing, and it's still 30k over 5.2 seconds. You're going to be able to do a lot of burst damage. Like if we look at our other skills like Meteor might do more damage overall than Ballista, but it's going to happen over 10 seconds versus half the time of 5 seconds. So in like Maelstrom Arena or bursting down an enemy, Ballista is going to be really, really strong. And in terms of meta performance, Ballista is the best ultimate we have for Maelstrom Arena for killing bosses, but for like killing trash and stuff, we're going to want to use other stuff. And then in trials, it's not going to be that good because we're going to be better off with Shooting Star or something of the sort, because enemies are going to be alive for such a long time that sustained DPS is going to be far more important. So, not a terrible ultimate. It has some uses, and in those uses, it's very strong, but I would kind of like to see it be made into a viable ultimate in terms of the entire game. So aside from just nuking the shit out of a player or an enemy in PvE or in PvP, it allowed for some sustained damage. So Ballista is really nice outside of that. And on top of the fact that it does a lot of damage in a short amount of time, is since it operates as a pet, you're allowed to still do damage. So the really nice thing about Ballista versus Toxic Barrage is while Toxic Barrage is going, you can't use any other skills. So you place down your dots and then you Toxic Barrage, but you can't do other skills. With Ballista, you place down your dots, you place down Ballista, and then you go back to spamming Snipe. So in terms of holistic DPS, Toxic Barrage might beat Ballista for DPS in terms of when comparing the ultimates, but when comparing the total amount of damage you can do, Ballista is going to be higher because it allows your character to act freely. So you can still do actions, you can still heal, you can dodge roll, versus Toxic Barrage, you are literally committed to this action and you can do nothing else. So Ballista is going to be really, really helpful in that regard as well. Free up versatility, allow us to be more reactive, and then still participate in our rotation. So this is why I usually suggest Ballista. However, Toxic Barrage is a lot of fun, and there are some uses for it if you like the Morag Tong stuff, if you like the max range. Then for single target damage, Toxic is going to be really, really strong too. So it's kind of a preference. However, in terms of meta performance, Ballista is going to see way more use than Toxic. So keep that in mind. Now we'll go on to our passive abilities. And our first passive ability is the one I've been referencing a lot in terms of damage, and that is long shots. And all it does is you gain a damage bonus when using a bow with your bow-based attacks, not all damage, by up to 12% based on how far you are. So when this ability starts scaling is you gain 1% increased damage at 5 meters away from your target. So once you're 5 meters away, this passive kicks in, and then you get the full listed 12% at 25 meters range. So the really nice thing about that is that poison arrow and snipe and our light attacks, we don't have to be at maximum range to get the long shots efficiency. We're going to be able to have 3 meters of like breathing room in terms of like how we can dip in and out, and then not lose the long shots passive efficiency. And on top of that, if we do need to walk into melee range for a bit, melee range is 5 meters, so we're still going to at least have this passive active to some extent if we need to get into melee range. So a very strong passive, especially when paired with snipe at max range and poison injection. You get a lot of free damage if you can maintain this. Now, in terms of meta performance, this is a blessing and a curse because it allows for some min-max damage, but it also forces you to a very ranged playstyle. So if you have ground-based AoEs that don't reach as far, or you have dots that are really strong that are melee casted and stuff, then you're not going to be able to make use out of them without sacrificing this passive's efficiency. So it's going to really enforce a very range-based game style that isn't going to sync up with meta performance all the time. Now, like I was talking about, I think they could do a lot with these skills, or maybe even the passive itself, to emphasize dipping in and out of melee range. So instead of just sitting afar and gaining the maximum benefit, they could totally rework it where you gained different bonuses while in melee range to kind of emphasize moving in and out and maintaining different things based on your situation, based on your rotation and stuff like that, allowing for really dynamic and rewarding gameplay. So I would love to see something happen with that. Regardless, very strong passive. Our next passive is called Accuracy, which increases your weapon critical by 1095, and all that is 5% weapon crit. Pretty straightforward. It's not too strong and it's not too weak. 5% crit is 5% crit. Very good in PvE, kind of in PvP. However, it doesn't only apply to weapon attacks. So any skill that uses weapon critical while you have a bow out, it's just going to be 5% extra crit. So it's like having a dagger out almost. Pretty nice. Our next passive is called Ranger, and Ranger is the cost reduction skill, like remember dual wield feat, controlled flurry, or two-handed balanced blade. Bow is going to be the exact same, just 20% cost reduction of bow skills. Very straightforward, going to help really bring down the cost of snipe, because without it, snipe's going to cost a crazy high stamina amount, so really helps reduce these values, even on like acid spray, like 2700, 3400, and then we swap to my bow, and then it's down to 2100 and 2700. So very, very strong, saving a lot of stamina management. Very helpful, but also very basic. Our next passive is called Hawkeye, and since I'm on the PTS, this is going to be a little bit stronger than on live, but all it does is every time you deal damage with a light or heavy attack, you gain a stack of Hawkeye, which increases your damage with bow-based abilities and damage functions, so light attacks will get them as well, by 5% for 4 seconds, and this stacks up to 5 times. So in terms of meta performance and efficiency, you can get this to be up to 25% more DPS with your bow. So if you like the bow route, then Hawkeye is going to be your most important passive to manage, because Hawkeye or long shots is 12%, but Hawkeye is 25. So when you add them together, you're getting 37% more damage, which is really, really strong, but it's also because the bow needs it so badly. So the biggest issue with this in terms of meta performance and like how accessible it is by the entire community is that snipe is your main spammable, right? So that's a 1.1 second cast time. So that means you literally have 3 seconds in between your spammable where you have to light attack. Meaning if you miss a single light attack, Hawkeye is going to vanish and you're going to have to regain your stack. So making a single mistake in your rotation is going to be devastating to your DPS and the efficiency of the uptime of this skill, which is going to really, really hurt it for people learning the bow. And it's why they're not going to be able to make use of the bow to the same level, despite bow still underperforming. I mean, 37% damage, and it's still being beat by dual wield, and it's being used as a support back bar instead of a main bar weapon. So, in terms of what to do with this skill, I think the 25% might be a little much because you're starting to get into the realm of, like, in PvP, if you're allowed to just sit at a range and ramp this up, you're just going to do really stupid high damage in burst increments, especially with, like, poison injection ticking and lethal arrow running with major defile. That's going to be a lot of damage. And then your long shots passive, so that's going to be an issue in PvP. So I think maybe tune it down to 20%, but increase the duration, please. The biggest issue with this skill was not how much damage it gave. I mean, even at 15%, it was strong. The issue is its duration. Missing a single light attack in a rotation just devastates your damage performance. And the biggest issue with the community is access and learning to the game, because it's so hard to maintain. And I'm not saying make it brain dead. Don't make it a 10-second buff, but make it at least 6 seconds so you can miss a single weave, so you can make a mistake once in a while, because we're human, right? As long as you're not a cheater and using macros or whatever they may be, then you're a human. You're going to make mistakes, or there's going to be a boss fight where you're not going to be able to sit there and just DPS. You're going to have to block, you're going to have to react, you're going to have to move, and you're not going to be able to just sit there and keep this passive up 100%. So I would really like to see the duration increase of this, because it would really help a lot of players learning it and allow for some human error in the bow playstyle, because right now it's just not there. And that's a big issue with it, is that if you aren't a really top tier player, then you can't use bow efficiently, even though bow is already underperforming compared to other weapons. So really don't understand why this increasing the damage was the route they took instead of increasing the duration just by a teensy little bit. Still, regardless, if you can make use of it, Hawkeye is an extremely powerful passive, and even more so once Update 13 goes live. Our last passive is called Hasty Retreat, and it is a utility passive. All it does is, while you have a bow equipped, whenever you dodge roll, you gain Major Expedition for 5 seconds. And all that does is increases your movement speed by 30%. So 30% move speed for 5 seconds. Really straightforward. Gonna help really cover some far distance with bow, helping you retreat or get in close or move with your group, whatever it may be. However, since this is Major Expedition now, it's not as strong as it used to be. Before, it used to be a flat movement speed, but now it can't be stacked with things like rapid maneuvers or other sources like speed potions. So just keep that in mind. If you're running speed potions or rapid maneuvers, you don't need to dodge roll anymore. But in combat, it's still very helpful. And then it just helps be Speedy Gonzalez, pretty much. Helps move around a little bit more. It's nice because not everything in a weapon line should be based around damage. There should be some utility in terms, especially when your skill line is based on movement. So, if anything, I would like to see it maybe reduce the dodge cost by a little bit, maybe like 5% dodge cost reduction, just to help out, emphasize using this passive more actively in combat. And then also remember what I said with the suggestion of emphasizing gameplay that wasn't necessarily on maximizing range. So maybe get in
then go back out, then get in, and then using hasty retreat as a viable means to do so. So dodge rolling to get in, doing some extra damage, getting up some stacking of a new passive or some sort, and then going back out at range and utilizing that major expedition. So there are a lot of options in the bow skill line that they could really make it a unique playstyle that wasn't just about safety and allowed for some min-maxing in terms of risk-reward gameplay. So I would love to see some stuff happen with bow. I think if they did that, it would be a very strong contender compared to dual wield, and we would see a lot of diversity for stamina builds out there. So I would love to see that happen. Let me know what you guys think. Hopefully this has helped you learn something in terms of like meta performance, like making a new build or something, especially since bows have kind of been in a rough spot for a while in PvE performance. People love them, but it's just like, why use anything but dual wield right now? And it's easy to see that when you compare two-handed dual wield and bow. It's just like dual wield has so many kick-ass damage abilities, two-handed has none, and then bow is like staggered by these passives which are really, really difficult to maintain. So a lot of its performance isn't applicable or accessible by people. So yeah, I would love to see some stuff happen with that. I really like the bow playstyle, but we'll see what happens. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. Again, hope this was helpful. Remember, if I misspoke anywhere during this or you have something to add, drop a comment. I'll make an annotation if I deem necessary. But thanks again, and I will see you all next time.